You are saying the Lord's Prayer. You are alone. Maybe you are in a hospital waiting room, one of those plastic chairs with the armrests that are always too high or too low, and a family member is somewhere behind a set of doors you cannot open. Maybe you are kneeling beside your bed at the end of a day that has been too long by half. Maybe you are standing at a graveside in November cold, the specific kind of cold that has weight to it, and the words are the only thing you know to say. Your lips know where to go before your mind does. Our Father, who art in heaven. Hallowed be thy name. You stop, not dramatically. Not because something shook you or because a doubt arrived with any force. You just stop. Because you are 43 or 51 or 67 years old, and you have been saying these words since you were small enough to stand on the pew beside your mother. And in this moment, for no reason you can name, you hear the word hallowed as if someone else has said it in front of you. Hallowed. When did you last use that word outside of this prayer? What does it mean? Not vaguely. Not the soft feeling of sacred importance you have always attached to it. What does it actually mean? You are not sure. Your lips keep going. They know the way. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. You finish. You sit in the silence after the last word, and for the first time, or maybe for the 1000th time, but clearly this time, you ask yourself a question you have never quite let yourself finish. Did you just say something? Or did you make a sound? My name is Nathan, former high school history teacher, Evansville, Indiana. 12 years at a Catholic school teaching world history and early Christianity. I resigned when the evidence kept leading me somewhere the institution was not prepared to follow. I want to talk to you about the prayer you just heard, not the prayer itself, the archaeology of the prayer. Because the Lord's Prayer exists in 3 separate and partially incompatible versions. Matthew chapter 6, verses 9 through 13. Luke chapter 11, verses 2 through 4. And behind both of them, earlier than both of them, in the language Jesus actually spoke, there is a 4th version. The one that has never been fully rendered in English, not once, in 1700 years of translation, in any version of the prayer you have ever said. The prayer you know is a translation of an approximation, with a closing borrowed from a different prayer, written for a different occasion, by a different man in a different century. The first and most important word, the word that opens the whole thing, the word Jesus actually said, has never appeared in English. I am going to take you through it word by word, because the further in you go, the stranger it gets. Let me start at the beginning. In the summer of my 28th year, I was working as a journalist on my first research trip to Israel. I was based in Jerusalem for 3 weeks, between stories, doing preliminary reading on early Christian communities. A mutual contact arranged for me to meet an elderly deacon from the Syriac Orthodox community in the Old City. His name was Yohanna. He was somewhere in his late 70s. His first language was a dialect of modern Aramaic, not an academic reconstruction, not a dead language, a living language that he had spoken since childhood and prayed in every day of his life. He knew the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic, not from a book, from his grandmother. We sat in a small room near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on an afternoon in August, and he agreed to teach me the opening line. Abun de Boashmaya neth Kadash Shmak. I tried to say it back to him. He stopped me at the first word. He said, gently, the way a teacher stops a student who has missed something foundational, he said, say Abun again. I said it again. He shook his head, not in frustration, in the specific way of someone pointing to something worth pointing to. The sound begins in the chest, he said. The lips close and then they open, like a breath that has been held and then released. Say it again. Slower. I said it a 3rd time. He nodded. Now you are saying something. I did not fully understand at the time what he meant. I understood it later, working through the scholarship of Neil Douglas Klotz. Douglas Klotz is a linguist and scholar of Semitic languages. His book, Prayers of the Cosmos, was published by HarperCollins in 1990. What he does in that book, methodically with full annotation, is go back to the Aramaic source words behind the Greek of the Lord's Prayer. word by word. What was there before the translation? And the first thing he finds is Abwun, the word your Bible renders as our Father. Abwun contains two distinct Aramaic roots, ab, which carries the meaning of father, source, progenitor, and wun, which carries the meaning of womb, birthing force, generative ground. A single word, both simultaneously. Douglas Klotz translates it as O birther of the cosmos, or Father Mother of the universe, or in his most literal rendering, O breathing life of all. And he notes what Johanna demonstrated to me in that room in Jerusalem. The word is designed to be experienced in the body before it is processed in the mind. The closing of the lips, the opening, the breath, the sound itself enacts the meaning, something held, then released. Our Father flattens that into a single gendered noun. And here is the thing I keep returning to. Every English Bible for 1700 years has opened the Lord's Prayer with the words, Our Father. Not one of them has rendered Abwun. Not one. The first word Jesus said in the prayer he gave us has never appeared in English. That is not a translation difficulty that has been acknowledged and flagged and discussed. It is a substitution that has never been identified to the people saying the prayer. You have been opening this prayer with a word that carries a fraction of what Jesus was opening it with. Your entire life. And nobody mentioned it. If you have ever felt that the prayer was working even when the words felt empty, if you have ever finished the recitation and had the strange sensation that you were reaching towards something the English words couldn't quite hold, you were not imagining that. You were right. You were reaching past the translation, and what you were reaching toward was still there, on the other side of the words. Abun was there. The word that begins in the chest and opens. The word that contains both the father and the womb. The word designed to be felt before it is understood. You were always trying to say that word, you just weren't given it. Now I want to give you the piece that made me set everything down and walk away from my desk for an hour when I first traced it through the manuscript record. Every Lord's Prayer you have ever said ends the same way. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen. You have said those words hundreds of times, thousands. They feel inseparable from the prayer. The proper conclusion, the resolution, the landing the whole thing is building toward. They were written by a scribe, not by Jesus, a scribe working in the 5th century or later, who added them to close a prayer that he felt needed a more formal ending. Here is the manuscript evidence. The two oldest complete New Testament manuscripts in existence are the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus. The Codex Sinaiticus is held at the British Library in London. The Codex Vaticanus is held in the Vatican Library. Both are dated to the 4th century. Both are written in Greek. Both represent the most reliable surviving texts of the New Testament we have. In both of them, Matthew chapter 6, verse 13, ends at deliver us from evil. Full stop. No doxology. No for thine is the kingdom. No forever and ever. The prayer ends there. Tertullian, writing in approximately 200 of the Common Era, quotes the Lord's Prayer at length without the doxology. Origen, working in the 3rd century, comments on the prayer verse by verse. He does not comment on the doxology because it is not in the text he is working from. Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage in the mid-3rd century, quotes the prayer multiple times in his treatise on the Lord's Prayer. No doxology. The closing appears in 5th century Byzantine manuscripts. It is not present in the critical apparatus of the Novum Testamentum Grace, the standard scholarly Greek New Testament, as part of the original text. Bart Ehrman, professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, identifies the doxology in Misquoting Jesus, published by Harper I in 2005, as one of the most clearly documented additions in the entire manuscript tradition. Where did it come from? The scholarly consensus points to 1 Chronicles, chapter 29, verse 11. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness, the power, the glory, the victory, and the majesty. That is David's prayer at the dedication of the temple, an Old Testament passage, a king's offering for a building. A scribe, working centuries after Jesus, encountered the Lord's Prayer and found it needed a more liturgically satisfying conclusion. He borrowed the language from David's treasury prayer and attached it. For 1700 years, Christians have been completing Jesus' prayer with words from a different prayer, by a different man, in a different century, for a different purpose. The silence after "deliver us from evil" was not an accident. That was the end of the prayer. Jesus left it there, and someone decided 400 years later that it needed a closing. Now let me give you the word that is not in Matthew's Gospel. Every week in churches across the English-speaking world, Christians say, "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us." Trespasses is not in Matthew chapter 6, verse 12. That is not a contested claim. That is the Greek text. Matthew chapter 6, verse 12 uses the word ophilemata. It means debts, financial language, an amount owed, a balance that has accumulated. Luke chapter 11, verse 4 uses a different word, hamartias, which means sins, moral failures, missing the mark. Two Gospels. Two different words. The word trespasses, in Greek paraptoma, appears in Matthew chapter 6, verses 14 and 15, 2 verses after the prayer, in a separate comment Jesus makes about forgiveness. It is not in the prayer itself. Trespasses entered the Lord's Prayer through Origen in the 3rd century, when he used it while teaching the prayer. It was then standardized in English in the 1549 Book of Common Prayer, compiled under Archbishop Thomas Cranmer during the reign of Edward VI. Half of English-speaking Christianity has been reciting a word that does not appear in the verse they are reciting. Not a mistranslation, a replacement. And the Aramaic behind Matthew's Greek is more specific still. The word Douglas Klotz identifies in the source is Kaubain. He translates it as wrong turnings, missed steps, disconnections from the source, not trespasses, not even debts exactly. The images of a path, someone walking, a series of moments where they turned the wrong way, not moral crimes, not legal violations, wrong turnings. Forgive us our wrong turnings, as we forgive those who took wrong turnings toward us. That is a different prayer than the one you have been saying, not in a vague spiritual sense. In a specific lexical sense, the word meant something different, and the word substituted for it meant something else again. There are 2 more words I need to give you before we are done with the archaeology. Thy kingdom come. That is the English rendering of the Aramaic malkuthach titha. Malkuthach, in English. Kingdom, a masculine noun, a concept built around a king, a hierarchy, authority flowing downward from a single elevated point. But the Aramaic word malkuthach is grammatically feminine. Douglas Klotz traces it to the root malka, and in its feminine form the word carries a different resonance. Not kingdom in the sense of a king's domain, something closer to queendom or divine sovereignty expressed in its feminine principle. The same root appears in Kabbalah as Malkuth, the feminine divine presence as it manifests in the material world. The prayer is asking for something feminine to arrive, something that contains the creative, receptive, generative principle. Every English translation for 1700 years has rendered it as a masculine concept, his kingdom, and the final word. The prayer, you know, ends, "Deliver us from evil." Evil. In English, that word carries force, moral corruption, a dark, opposing power. The Aramaic word is bisha. Douglas Klotz translates it as unripeness, not evil in the sense of an opposing force. Unripeness, the condition of something that has not yet become what it was meant to become, something that has not reached its proper development. Deliver us from unripeness, rescue us from the condition of not yet what we were made to be. That is a different prayer again, not a prayer against a supernatural enemy. A prayer about incompleteness, about the human condition of being not yet finished. And 1700 years of English translation has rendered that as "deliver us from evil." The word is still in the Aramaic. It has been there the whole time. You knew something was wrong with the recitation. Not always, not loudly, but at some point, at a funeral maybe, saying the prayer with 50 other people in a church that smelled of lilies and old stone, the words coming out of your mouth on their own, from somewhere below thought. You noticed. You were not praying. You were producing sounds that had the shape of prayer. Your mouth was doing one thing and your mind had gone somewhere else. When you finished, you weren't sure what had just happened, except that you had said the words correctly and felt nothing in particular. You filed that moment away, not as doubt, as something uncomfortable that didn't have a name. The name was already in your Bible. 3 verses before Jesus gives the Lord's Prayer, in Matthew chapter 6, verse 7, he says this: "When you pray, do not use battalogia, as the pagans do." Battalogia. The Greek word means vain repetition, babbling, idle sounds without engagement. Words said again and again until they become syllables, and the syllables become sounds, and the sounds become nothing. Jesus was so specifically aware of this danger that he named it in the same teaching where he gave the prayer. The warning and the prayer are in the same chapter, the same discourse, separated by 2 verses. And then, within 1 generation, the Didache records what happened. The Didache is the oldest surviving community manual in Christian history. Scholars date it to approximately 95 to 110 of the Common Era. Early Christian communities writing down for their own use how to live as followers of Jesus. The Didache instructs, pray the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day, not once, not when the Spirit moves you, 3 times daily, on schedule. The antidote became the disease within 1 generation. What you felt at that funeral, the hollow of words said past their meaning, was not a failure of faith. It was the accurate reading. Jesus named it in verse 7. He warned that this would happen. And then the institution took his warning and built a practice schedule out of the prayer he gave to replace it. You were not wrong to notice. You were reading the situation more clearly than the instructions told you to. Across the 10 volumes of Caballo de Troya, J. Benitez's reconstruction of events in 1st century Palestine, narrated by time-traveling American pilots embedded in the period, the observers watch Jesus pray dozens of times. They never once see him recite a formula. Not a single time. The Jesus of Caballo de Troya prays in Galilean Aramaic, often alone, often early in the morning or late at night. Sometimes in words, sometimes in something the narrators describe as a state of communicated presence that is not verbal at all. He does not lead group recitation. He does not repeat the same sequence. And Benitez, in the commentary sections where he steps out of the narrative to address the reader directly, returns specifically to Matthew chapter 6, verse 7. He writes in the context of the Lord's Prayer, in the 3rd volume, the men who built the institution on this prayer were doing precisely what the prayer warns against. Not through malice, through the institutional need for a common practice, something that could be said together at the same time, that would produce the feeling of unified belonging. A formula does that. A formula creates belonging, at the cost of meaning. Now I want to be honest about where I hold Benitez's work. He is not a peer-reviewed scholar. His methodology in Caballo de Troya operates outside the verification standards that Bart Ehrman or Neil Douglas Klotz would apply. The time travel framework requires commitments I cannot make in the same way. But his observation about battalogia is not dependent on the time travel premise. It is a reading of a canonical text. Anyone with a Bible can check it. Matthew chapter 6 verse 7, then verse 9. The warning, then the prayer. Both there. Same chapter. He has been pointing to that sequence for 40 years. So has the text. And the Didache is not a Benitez document. It is an archaeological record. Early Christians, 60 to 70 years after the crucifixion, within living memory of the generation that was present, writing down their communal life, a decentralized mobile movement, traveling prophets, no bishops, no fixed liturgy, no succession of authority. The Eucharist could be celebrated in any home, and already, in that document, the Lord's Prayer is being scheduled 3 times a day. The institutionalization happened faster than almost anyone realizes. The suppression this investigation is about is not an archive, not a burned manuscript, not a text discovered in a clay jar. The suppression happened in plain sight. The words were preserved. The warning in the same passage was not passed on, and the result, 17 centuries later, is that the most repeated words in Christian history are the words most people have never actually heard. It is evening now. I am sitting at my desk in Evansville. The light through the blinds is the color it gets in late October. Orange, low, almost gone. I want to end by doing something I don't normally do in these videos. I want to say the prayer, not the English version, the Aramaic, slowly. Abun de Boishmaya, O birther of the cosmos, Father Mother of the universe, the one whose breath made everything and whose making is still ongoing. Nethkadash Shmach, let your name, the sacred nature of what you are, be the thing we move toward and hold. Tita Malkuthash, let your divine sovereignty come, the feminine creative presence, arriving into the material world where we live. Newet Sevianach Aikana de Boishmaya of Barha, let your intention become real here, in the same way it is real in the expanse we cannot see. Havlan Lachma de Sumkanan Yaumana, give us what we need, the day's portion, enough for this day. Washboklan Haubaine Kenna Dafklan Shbokan Lahayabain, release us from our wrong turnings, as we release others from theirs. Wela Tahlan Linashyuna Illa Patsan Min Bisha, do not let us be brought to the place of being tested beyond what we can hold. Free us from unripeness. That translation is Douglas Klotz's Prayers of the Cosmos, HarperCollins, 1990. I am using his work. The doxology, for thine is the kingdom, the power and the glory, is absent here too, as it was in the Codex Sinaiticus, as it was in the Codex Vaticanus, as it was in every early church writer before the 5th century. Jesus left the prayer ending at the request for freedom from unripeness. That is where the prayer ends. Something happened when I said that version for the first time. Not read it, said it. It sounded like something a person would say to someone they trusted, not a formula, a conversation. Now I want to ask you to do one thing, just one. Say the opening word, abun. Slowly, without rushing. Feel where it starts. The lips close on the BW. Then they open. The breath that has been held and then released. That is what Jesus said when he opened this prayer. That is what you were always reaching toward when you said, Our Father. The word is still there. Neil Douglas Klotz published the full Aramaic translation in 1990. The Codex Sinaiticus has been freely available online since 2009. The oldest complete New Testament in existence. You can read it yourself. Matthew chapter 6, verse 13 ends where it ends. No doxology. Matthew chapter 6, verse 7 is in every Bible you have ever owned. The suppression is not archival. It is not in a sealed jar in the Egyptian desert or a restricted archive in Rome. It is in the habit of saying this prayer 3 times a day across 17 centuries without once being told what the first word meant, or that the last sentence was added by a scribe, or that the word for wrong turnings became trespasses somewhere in the medieval transmission, or that the kingdom being asked for was feminine in the original. The original is still there. It has always been there. Abun de Boishmaya. Say it slowly. That is what Jesus said. That is what you were always trying to say. You decide what to do with this. This is Nathan. Forbidden Gospels.